It is, of course, an absolute pleasure and a privilege to follow Christiana Figueres. Also terrifying. So I'd like to start by thanking the Hillary Institute and Mark for putting me up to it. Tonight we celebrate the 5th anniversary of an historic day in our fight to protect our planet for future generations. And we honour a woman whose work was of central significance to bring about the Paris Agreement. I know you know this, but it goes without, it is worth saying again. For decades, scientists have said that rising levels of greenhouse gases would someday disrupt the fragile balance of our planet's atmosphere. And as the level of pollution continued to rise year after year, politicians have known since at least the 1980s that a strong global agreement to reduce those emissions was necessary. The question was never about whether we should act, but rather whether we would do so before it was too late. But time and again, we have been frustrated in the pursuit of that goal until 5 years ago today, when the world had its moment, a moment where we came together and decided that if we are to pass on a stable planet to our children and to our grandchildren, then we must act. And the Paris Agreement was the result. Now, if we follow through on the commitments that the Paris Agreement embodies, and that is a big if, then future generations will look back on it as the turning point for our planet. Of course, it took a lot of hard work and a long time before we were able to reach a moment where the Paris Agreement was not only possible, but actually up to the task of tackling the climate crisis. And so tonight it is my great privilege and honour to commemorate one of the leading figures who led the world to this point, someone who worked tirelessly with steady and persistent effort, someone who never wavered from her singular focus of leaving behind a cleaner, a safer, a more stable world, someone who led with stubborn, perhaps militant optimism, and never lost hope, even in those moments when maybe the rest of us did. Now, Christiana Figueres took over the climate talks in 2009 in the wake of what was a pretty chaotic summit in Copenhagen. Now, as an observer in Copenhagen, I felt as if the last few days there, as if a dense psychic pall sort of descended over the city to cloak it as the talks stuttered to a close. But from the wreckage of those talks, the principle that all nations have a role to play in combating climate change was salvaged. And this is what would provide the basis of Christiana's work for the next 6 years. And just 2 years into her leadership, countries reached an agreement in Durban that negotiations should start on a new global climate deal, which would be adopted in 2015. And so the road to Paris had begun. Now, I don't need to tell you that global climate diplomacy isn't easy, and it has been largely unsuccessful. Over half of all greenhouse gas emissions into the atmosphere since the start of the Industrial Revolution in 1750 have taken place since 1990, which coincidentally was also the year that we decided we should stop putting greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. Progress is frustratingly slow. Moments of victory are rare, and the path to consensus is littered with hurdles. Before she took over, the orthodoxy of climate negotiations said that agreements had to be based on top-down, legally binding targets and timetables for reducing emissions with rigorous rules. This, in effect, is what led to the failure in Copenhagen. But for Christiana, progress towards a climate agreement had to be more collaborative. Talks needed to be based on trust, on transparency, on strong and inclusive relationships, and the constant evaluation of what was going well and what could be improved. She also understood the way that countries' domestic politics shaped what they could do on the global stage. Lean too much in one direction, and the structure would fall apart. Lean too much in the other direction, and the structure would fall apart. that it took only 4 years after Durban to deliver a global agreement to cut emissions, and that we could unite 195 countries behind a single goal is remarkable, and it's testament to Christiana's leadership approach. Her success with the Paris Agreement created the space for countries to continually ramp up their ambition, which many are now moving to do. Tonight, as was mentioned, at the Sprint to Glasgow event, we will see a whole raft of countries come forward with new commitments to reduce their emissions. And that is because Christiana has helped to create a world in which climate action is seen as important to global standing and to reputation. And this, of course, raises, at least in the minds of this audience, a question. What does it mean for Aotearoa New Zealand? Now, in our first term in government, we passed the Zero Carbon Act, which has as its purpose a commitment for New Zealand to live within the threshold of 1.5 degrees of global warming. We adopted the 1.5 degrees threshold for two reasons. First of all, the Paris Agreement commits us to, quote, holding the global temperature increase to well below 2 degrees Celsius, above pre-industrial levels, and pursuing efforts to limit the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. In translating the Paris Agreement into domestic law, anything other than 1.5 degrees would not be pursuing efforts towards 1.5 degrees. That would be pursuing efforts towards something else. Secondly, in 2018, in the middle of drafting the Zero Carbon Bill, the IPCC released their report on 1.5 degrees. The picture it painted of a world where temperatures increased beyond that point was so stark, it was obvious to us we couldn't do anything else. Now, as soon as the Climate Change Commission was established, I asked them to provide me with advice on whether our existing nationally determined contribution, lodged in 2016, is consistent with that 1.5 degrees threshold contained in the Paris Agreement and now in our domestic law. I am keenly awaiting their advice, their draft advice, on the 1st of February next year. As of tonight, there are only 50 sleeps left. Alongside their advice, I am actually looking forward to it more than Christmas. Alongside their advice on the NDC, they'll be providing us with advice on the first 3 emissions budgets, the biogenic methane component of our 2050 emissions reduction target, and what policy areas we should pursue in order to deliver what's needed. Now, I don't want to get ahead of the Commission, but I have a feeling that my work program in response, sandwiched between their final advice at the end of May and COP26 in Glasgow in November, will be busy. Part of the response will be a statutory emissions reduction plan to guide the economy to stay within those emissions budgets. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. It is going to require some very tough calls, because what is likely to be required of New Zealand mirrors what is required of the rest of the world. If we are to have any hope at all of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels, we must cut carbon dioxide emissions in half by 2030. That is why, at the first opportunity after the formation of the new government, we declared that we are in a state of climate emergency. The Cabinet has collectively agreed that our government considers climate change, and I'm quoting from the Cabinet paper here, to be of a level of equivalence to a civil defence emergency, which I know most of you know something about around here, and demands a sufficiently ambitious, urgent and coordinated response across government to meet the scale and complexity of the challenge. End quote. Public sector chief executives have been directed to prioritise and complete outstanding tasks assigned to them in our existing all-of-government climate action plan, which itself was a response to the Productivity Commission's recommendations of 2018. And the Prime Minister will be chairing a committee of ministers, which means that they will definitely show up, who have particular responsibility for both our mitigation and adaptation work programs. To me, to the Prime Minister, and to our government, it's clear that unless we name this as an emergency and act accordingly, we will have no hope of fulfilling the commitments that the previous government signed up to in Paris. The reason we even have the Paris Agreement, of course, is because Christiana stayed true to what the moment required. She understood that reaching an agreement to tackle the climate crisis wasn't just a job for politicians, although it is a job for politicians, but for all of us, making the case for action to civil society groups, businesses, small island nations, economists, policymakers, public health experts, academics, schools. Christiana was able to build a coalition of people all over the world who are willing to stand up for their own futures. I want to thank the chair of the Hillary Institute, the outgoing chair of the Hillary Institute, Aniki Goodall, for hosting us here tonight. It's good to see you again, Aniki. I want to thank the Hillary trustees and Hillary fellows who are here, not only for welcoming us here tonight, but also for your ongoing contribution to the Institute as leaders in your communities. I know that it takes a lot of work to make these occasions happen, and I am tremendously grateful to all of you who work behind the scenes to make it happen. I'd also like to thank Helen Clark for her contribution as a patron of the Institute, and Mayor Dalziel. It's good to see you again too. The Christchurch City Council, for those of you who don't know, has set itself the target of becoming carbon neutral by 2030, which was one of the first councils around Aotearoa, New Zealand, to declare a climate change emergency. So you led us in your work, and I'm very grateful for that. And thank you, all of you, for being here tonight, but most of all, for her extraordinary and her tireless work to first fashion and now to uphold the global agreement to stave off the climate crisis. Thank you to Christiana Figueres. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa.